When I was a seminary student in Texas, one of the vice presidents of the school called for me. A fellow student was dispatched with the message that the VP wanted to see me. And all the way up to his office, I worried why I had been summoned. Had I inadvertently taken all the wrong classes and now I had to start over? Was I about to be chastised for the time I put a phony parking ticket on some guy's bicycle because he parked in my favorite spot? Had the psychological test they gave me revealed paranoid schizophrenia and the heartbreak of psoriasis, and now I was disqualified for ministry? All such thoughts were swirling through my head, and by the time I got to the vice president's door, I was convinced my seminary days were over, and I would soon be slinking out of Fort Worth in the dead of night, my self-respect in rags, the word Ichabod tattooed on my forehead. I slinked into the vice president's office. "You called for me?" He handed me a check from an organization I'd never heard of called the Knights Templar of Georgia. And he said, every year, this group selects a few students from Georgia who are studying theology and they give them a financial gift to help with their studies. And this year, you were on the list. I was flabbergasted. It never occurred to me that the call might be good news. I was called for, and it was a gift to me. Why do I assume the worst? I mean, when I'm summoned, when I'm called for, why do I assume that everything is going to go wrong? Why can I see Armageddon coming on a sunny day? Paris, I need to come and talk with you. Oh, no. Paris, there's a certified letter for you in the post office. Oh, dear. Paris, while you were out, somebody from the F.C.C office in Cleveland called you and said, call him back, it's urgent. Oh, this is all over. 9 times out of 10, the summonses turn out just fine. So why am I so good at seeing calamity? After all, I'm here in this life because I was called for, just like you are alive because you were called for. You say you never thought of it that way? Well, it's right there in the book of Genesis. God takes the dust of the ground and fashions the first human being, and then takes one of the man's ribs and fashions the first woman. The man was okay with it because he wasn't using that rib anyway. Now, it's a beautiful story, but it leaves an unanswered question. Why? Why does the great God of creation create creatures like us? Genesis doesn't say, but James Weldon Johnson's grand poem that you just heard and saw a moment ago, I think James Weldon Johnson's poem, The Creation, fills in the blanks, at least for me. And God stepped out on space, and He looked around and He said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. Could it be that God found existence to be so wonderful that He wanted to share it with somebody? As God spoke the world into existence, could it be that God wanted another ear to hear and a voice to respond? Could it be that God desired companionship, not because God found something lacking in His own person, but because He wanted another being to know the joy of aliveness? I think so. The first man and woman were summoned by God, called for by the Almighty. So was I, and so are you. I wasn't just born. I was called for. You weren't just born. You were called for. We weren't just plopped down into the world fully formed. We were called for. Tom Long says when parents name a child, they are summoning a person who is not yet all he or she could be. The name they give summons their deepest hopes for the child, calling the child forth to receive the parent's best gifts, calling the child out of isolation to be with them. The name my parents gave me called me forth to become something I might not have been otherwise. Paris is my mother's maiden name. And by giving me the name of Confederate Captain Henry Paris, my mom and dad summoned everything that is joyful and distressing about being a Southerner. By giving me that name, they called me to a fierce family heritage. By giving me that name, they called me to a set of values laced with honeysuckle and sweet tea. I wasn't just born. Like God speaking into the darkness, my name called me forth. I wasn't just born, I was called for. You weren't just born, you were called for. When Arthur Margaret Feinberg took a course taught by poet Maya Angelou at Wake Forest University, she was surprised at the amount of class time Angelou spent having all the students say their names, spell their names, and have them learn each other's names. She did it the first time the class met, she did it the second time the class met, and the third time the class met. And finally, she asked the class, why did I just spend nearly 20% of our very valuable class time together making sure you know each other's names? And as so often is the case in a college class, there was deafening silence. So Angelou answered her own question. She said, because your name is a sign of your dignity. And when you recognize someone's name, you recognize them not just as human, but as a person. One of the greatest ways you bestow human dignity on someone is by calling them by name. God has called you by name. You were called for at creation, and you continue to be called for. Physical birth happens only once. Being called for happens again and again. Frederick Buechner puts it this way. He says, God calls me to be this rather than that. He calls me to be here rather than there. He calls me to be now rather than then. You were called for out of that primeval chaos. You were called for out of the nothingness of life before you existed. You were called for into the promises and perils of this day, and you are called forth into the unknown of tomorrow. Pastor Glenn McDonald and his wife were on a Caribbean cruise. And late at night on their very first day at sea, McDonald and his wife were sound asleep, of course, when they were awakened by a voice over their cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'm very sorry to disturb you so early in the morning, but we have an urgent concern. We have an unconfirmed report that a passenger has fallen overboard. We've already turned the ship around and initiated a search. If you are not in your room at this time, please return to your room and account for everybody in your party. If anyone is missing, please report their name to the purser's desk immediately. 30 minutes passed. Through his cabin window, McDonald could see searchlights sweeping all across the swells of black water in the pre-dawn darkness. The U.S. and Dutch Coast Guards had arrived on the scene. Finally, the captain came over the intercom a second time. He said, ladies and gentlemen, 2 men are currently unaccounted for. Their names are John Garcia and Eric Armstrong. If you know the whereabouts of either of these men, bring word to us right away. Now, you have to realize there were 1,700 passengers on that ship and more than 700 crew members. So out of a list of 2,400 people, the captain had narrowed the search down to just 2 individuals. 15 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're looking for Eric Armstrong. McDonald knew that the energies of everybody on board were now focused on the search for one solitary person. 2 hours later, the sun rose over the Caribbean. And once again, they heard the captain's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to tell you we have just found Eric Armstrong. A U.S. Coast Guard helicopter is at this moment airlifting him to safety. He appears to be in good condition. And all over the ship, McDonald heard applause and cries of elation. And later on, they found out who Eric Armstrong was. He wasn't a corporate CEO. He wasn't a U.S. senator. He wasn't first mate on board the ship. He wasn't even somebody related to the captain. No, it turns out he was some doofus 20-year-old who climbed into a restricted area and was doing the Titanic thing on the bow of the boat. You know, I'm king of the world. Unlike Kate Winslet, though, he fell overboard. So the captain had turned the entire ship around and concentrated all his efforts on finding one person who was doing the wrong thing at the wrong place at the wrong time. So before dinner that night, Glenn McDonald got in line to meet the captain, because he said he wanted to shake hands with the man who would pull out all the stops to call for a nobody lost in the chaos of the high seas. Friend, you weren't just born. You were called for. And God continues to call for you on your good days and on your bad days, when you shine as bright as the sun and when you're dumber than a bag of hammers. And God will continue to call for you right up until and beyond the moment you slip off into the mystery of eternity. Did you hear what Jesus said? In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, will I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. Friends, walk through the empty tomb and you'll find a place for you, as well as a God who says, welcome home. I've been calling for you, you know. A young boy was suffering from leukemia. And to take his mind off her son's aches and pains, the boy's mother spent every minute she could reading to him. And one day she was reading him stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and there were lots of battles being fought and lots of people falling in battle. And when she closed the book, she noticed her son looking very thoughtful. She said, "What's on your mind, honey?" He said, "Mommy, what's it like to die?" Well, Mom fought back tears and she breathed a silent prayer for wisdom. She took a deep breath and said, "Son, do you remember back before you got sick? How you'd play outside all day and you'd come in for supper tired and worn out, and after supper you'd fall asleep on the sofa. Do you remember that?" He said, "Yeah." Mom said, "Did you ever wonder how you woke up the next morning in your own bed with your pajamas on?" The boy said, "Yeah, how did that happen?" His mom said, "Well, while you were asleep, your dad came in and gently picked you up and carried you to your room. He slowly changed your clothes so that you wouldn't wake up, and then he tucked you into bed. He did that because he loves you so much." It's the same with death. Jesus comes to you and gently picks you up and carries you to the place He has prepared for you. He does it because He loves you. You, my friend, were not just born into this world. You were called for. And because of Easter, even death cannot silence that calling. Amen.